Good morning, everyone. I'm going to give one more minute before we begin. Good morning. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for virtually joining us today. My name is Lieutenant Junior Grade Catherine Marcenelle, and with me helping me moderate is Lieutenant Junior Grade Trisha Talens. We are a part of the Bay Area Women's Leadership Initiative chapter, and it is our distinct pleasure today to present to you our 5th speaker series event, Understanding Forms of Institutional Racism and How It Impacts Representation in Our Service. And our amazing speakers with us today are Commander Marcas Canady, Commander Andrea Smith, and YN1 Andrea Marasigan. They will delve into the different forms of institutional racism and how certain policies, past and present, impact representation in our service. We would like to acknowledge the fact that the voices of our panels today speak for themselves and their own experiences, and they do not speak for the entirety of the Black experience in the Coast Guard. Additionally, we acknowledge that we don't have all the answers and hope that this conversation is a beginning of a richer dialogue to follow. To that end, we will have time for question and answer at the end and learn how we can all be an ally in our service. Before we begin, I'd like to give a couple of brief introductions to our panelists. Commander Marcas Canady graduated from the Coast Guard Academy in 2000 with a Bachelor's of Science in Operations Research. He first reported to Coast Guard Cutter Laguerre as a deck watch officer, and after his first tour, reported to Pensacola, Florida to begin flight school training. In May of 2011, Commander Canady began postgraduate studies at Syracuse University, where he earned a master's in business administration and an executive master's in public administration. He is currently the commanding officer of Air Station Houston, Texas. Commander Canady is happily married to his wife, Angelise, and has 3 children, Marlise, Corinne, Major Allen, and Maverick Malaya. Commander Andrea Smith graduated from the Coast Guard Academy in 2001 with a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering. At her current unit, she joined the staff of Coast Guard Recruiting Command in June of 2020. As Executive Officer, she supports the commanding officer at executing the strategic vision and direction to lead the dispersed crew of 500 plus military, civilian, and contractor personnel to hire approximately 4,500 new members annually. Commander Smith holds a master's degree in business administration from the University of Georgia and a Master of Science in Engineering Management from the University of New Orleans. Commander Smith is happily married to Mr. Robert Smith, and they have 1 daughter, Parker Elizabeth. YN1 Andrea Marasigan entered the Coast Guard in 2010 from Recruiting Office, Charlotte, North Carolina. Upon graduating boot camp in 2010, she was assigned to Coast Guard Station Bodega Bay in Bodega Bay, California, serving as a seaman. YN1 completed the YNA school program in 2011. YN1 is currently assigned to Pay and Personnel Center Human Resources Business Analytics team, serving as the CYRUS Support Manager. YN1 Marasigan is happily married to CS1 Jesus Marasigan, and they have 1 daughter, Miracle. Please join me in offering our panelists A warm and virtual welcome to our Bay Area Coast Guard community. We are so lucky to have them with us here today.
Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. Please keep in mind that this webinar is being recorded. This is a webinar, so you can see other attendees, only panelists and hosts. You can, however, use the chat function, and we encourage you to do so. If you have any questions, you can type them in the chat, and we will leave some time for audience questions at the end. Thank you, panelists. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Commander Andrea Smith, and thank you for that introduction. Commander Canady, YN1 Marasigan, and I are all humbled and excited to be participants in today's discussion. We want to echo what the moderators mentioned, though, that we are far from experts in this topic. There are scholars who have dedicated much energy and effort to research these topics, and we want to be clear that we are simply passionate about the topic at hand, specifically to race and how it shows up in our society and in our service. And most importantly, that our comments are only representative of our own perspectives. To really dive into the conversation today, we have decided to address the topics first by defining institutional racism. And Commander Canady will give some examples of the systems in our country that are impacted by the systems of racism. Next, we will discuss examples of those systems and how they impact our service. Finally, we're going to address how these issues impact representation throughout the Coast Guard. And we look forward to an opportunity for Q&A at the end. So I will turn it over now to Commander Canady.
Thank you, Commander Smith. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Really honored to be a part of this panel and this discussion. As Commander Smith mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about institutional racism, what the definition is, and some examples that I wanted to touch upon. Once again, these examples are not the only examples and don't have the time to really do a deep dive into them all, but I did want to highlight some forms of institutional racism that has taken place in our country that I do think has some relevance and impact on us today. So on the screen, you see the term institutional racism describes as societal patterns and structures that impose oppressive and otherwise negative conditions on identifiable groups on the basis of race or ethnicity. So that right there is a definition of institutional racism. So let's just quickly go ahead and look at some examples. So the first example that I wanted to touch upon is peonage. Peonage is basically debt servitude. How that played out in America is largely in the southern states. African-American men, after Reconstruction, after the end of slavery, they would be brought up on trumped up charges or minor infractions like black codes. And I'll talk about that in just a second. When these trumped up charges would be placed on them, they would be hit with fines and court fees. What a local employer would do is pay those court fees and those fines off. And now that African-American man was indebted to this local employer, and the only way that he could pay that debt was to work it off. So imagine living in a society where at any point you could be brought up on meaningless or imaginary charges, and now to pay it off, you had to work for a person. This system was in place up until the 1940s. So if you think about it, from Reconstruction all the way up to the 1940s, this systematic way of oppressing African American and mostly men at the time was in place until 1940s. As I mentioned, black codes. Now, black codes turned into what we now know are Jim Crow laws. These are laws that were on the books. In 1866, Texas had a constitutional convention where they put these black codes in place, where it was illegal for an adult African American not to have a job, violating curfew, owning a firearm, displaying objectionable behavior. In South Carolina, the rule in that state was if you're an African American, you could only be a farmer or a servant. These black codes and Jim Crow laws stayed in place until the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Segregation in schools. Now we're talking about education. We all know Plessy versus Ferguson, a US Supreme Court decision in 1896 made it legal in our country to segregate our schools. That's where the term separate but equal came about. But we all know that those separate schools were never equal. The schools where African Americans were forced to go to were obviously underfunded and under-resourced. They weren't given the advantages like their white counterparts. This stayed into play until the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So if you think about from 1896 to 1954, this was an institutional process that oppressed the African Americans in this country. And to give you an example of how recent that is, two examples. Ruby Bridges, she's the first student to desegregate schools in Louisiana. She's 66 years old. My parents were part of the first graduating class of Marlin High School in Marlin, Texas, the first class after desegregation. So their class was the first class that had both Black and white people in the same school. That is my parents. So once again, not too long ago. Voting. Just this past Sunday was the 56th anniversary of Bloody Sunday. This was an event where African Americans were fighting for the right for easy access to voting. Understand that in 1870, the 15th Amendment gave African Americans the right to vote, but because of things like poll taxes, unfair literacy tests, and simply just violence, there were a number of people that were killed simply trying to vote. That practice stayed into play until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So once again, 56 years ago, not that long ago. Employment, hiring practices. There were laws on the books that made it illegal to treat workers unfairly. But these laws that were on the book nationwide did not include agricultural workers and did not include a lot of service workers. So once again, if you think about it, if you're living in South Carolina and you can only be a farmer or only work in a job of service, these laws that made sure that your working conditions were fair did not include you. and it didn't include many African Americans. The March on Washington was basically about employment. I'm not sure if it's widely known now or talked about the paper bag test. This is where an employer would have a paper bag, and if the person that they were interviewing was darker than the paper bag, then they were disqualified for the position. Lynchings. I know we think about lynchings and we think about just the horrific scene of somebody hanging from a tree. It's a horrific scene, but it's something that really happened. I had an opportunity to visit the Memorial to Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. Its nickname is the Lynching Memorial. This is where they memorialized 4,400 African Americans that were lynched between 1877 and 1950. The reason why they stopped at 1950 was it was at that time that they started to hold people accountable for the murders of these people. So in touring this memorial, I learned about stories that I never heard about. I learned about the Elaine Massacre, which happened in 1919 in Arkansas, where over a 4-day period, over 100 African Americans were killed by lynch mobs and federal troops because these sharecroppers were asking for fair wages for their crops. So let's talk about the military. So obviously World War I, still a lot of segregation going on. Harlem Hellraisers, Henry Johnson. Those should be names that we should know because these are heroes. Henry Johnson was a person that was part of the Harlem Hellraisers, a segregated regiment that fought over in France for World War I, received pretty much the equivalent of the Medal of Honor from France for his heroic efforts, came back to the United States and was still dealt with the Jim Crow South segregation laws. He was not afforded health care. So even though he was injured fighting for this country, he was not given the benefits that a lot of the white soldiers were given in World War I. If you have heard the term the Red Summer of 1919, this is when a lot of these lynchings took place. Also, it coincides with when a lot of Confederate monuments were enacted. A lot of the reason for this tension was because of service members coming back expecting to be treated better. Now let's move to World War II and the GI benefits. The GI benefits for most of white middle America is where they got their leg up, where they got some of their advantages and opportunities to own houses for education. These benefits were, for the most part, denied to African American soldiers. So just imagine being a part of the greatest generation and then being shut out of the greatest opportunity to move your family and your community forward economically. This is where things happen like redlining and stuff like that with unfair housing practices and things of that nature. So those are just some examples that I wanted to give of institutional racism that have happened in the past in this country as we move forward with the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
All right, good morning, everybody. This is YN1 Marasigan here, and I'm going to help us guide our discussion beginning with grooming standards. And first, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to give my perspective on this matter. So grooming standards in the Coast Guard has been something that has been evolving over time. I've been in the Coast Guard for 11 years, and I've seen many changes, and that's due to a lot of people's effort. A lot of active work was taking place to make sure that the grooming standards have been updated. So the policy is continually being updated, and the most recent update was July of 2020. And, you know, just some bullet points on some of those updates include the bulk of hair went up to 4 inches for a bun, not to exceed 3.5 inches from the scalp. Nail polish was included, and these are on the female side of the grooming standards specifically. But also notable things that were updated were the pictures, so that the visual representation. There have always been pictures in the manual, but I think that they're more representing the different types of styles rather than just the standard slick back bun that has been perceived as the standard. So the policy has been updated, but unfortunately, the thing that's harder to change is changing the perception of what is professional in the workplace. And that's something that is an issue in all facets of the workplace in corporate America and in the military. So the perception that perhaps natural hair as it grows out of my head may or may not be professional to you, because my hair does not grow straight. There are things that have to take place in order for that image to manifest. There's quite a bit of trouble that goes with that. So the perception is much harder to target. It's something that's harder to pinpoint. But I think a good start is the policy change. So going from there, I would like to give a personal experience in the Coast Guard. Like I said, I came in 11 years ago, and when I came in, I had dreadlocks, and they were small. And the manual at the time said no widely spaced hanging locks. And, you know, my recruiter was Black and male, and he researched, and he said, yours aren't widely spaced. They're less than a 1/4 inch. They're smaller than most box braids or micro braids. It shouldn't be an issue. Now I went to boot camp. They shaved my head, not all the way down, not quite as smooth as Commander Kenady's, but you know, they got my hair down to a short curly fro that was possibly no more than 1 inch long. But I was harassed continually there and at my first duty station that I was unprofessional. My hair was back, you know, it was a short curly fro, but that didn't, even though technically the policy didn't say it was wrong, the perception was that it was unprofessional. And the policy does state it's the CO's determination on a neat and professional appearance. So that's really subjective, and that's something that can become a problem once we get into subjective territory. But you know, it goes past 11 years ago. It went to my first duty station when I had box braids. A shipmate pulled me aside, another Black female, been in a little bit longer, and she noticed I was getting hassled. And she said, you know, it's one thing that I found to be helpful is to have a copy of the policy in my pocket. You know, when you're a minority, whether you want to or not, you draw attention if you're the only minority in a predominantly majority space. So it's just helpful if you have the reference point that you're within the regs. And I followed that for some time, even though it seemed unnecessary when my shipmates could come in, you know, loose bun and arguably less professional looking than me, and they weren't getting stopped. They weren't getting their bun measured, but I was, because it's easier to notice a person who doesn't look the same as everyone else. And that's something that continues, that perception of what is okay, whether or not it's in line with the policy. And that also, it goes a lot into how comfortable and how productive people are in the workplace. If you feel as though you're constantly under a scrutiny, if you're expecting that, that can lead to less productivity. And sadly, it's something that persists, and it's not necessarily just on the female side. you know, as when I was an instructor at Trace and Petaluma, oftentimes, so there are very few Black instructors, there's a few of us, but a lot of times the students, the minority students would be drawn to us. They would come to us when we're standing duty, people who weren't even in my class, my students, and they would tell me about how they were getting hassled about their hair. And I found myself giving the exact same advice that I received when I was an E4, like, here, I'll print out the policy for you so that you can reference that your hair looks exactly like this picture and your hair is authorized. And that's not necessarily something that should still be going on when we've made the strides and we've made the changes, and 10 years later, the best I can do is repeat the same advice. So I still think that this is a conversation that needs to be had, and this is a dialogue that needs to be had. And then on the flip side, for male students, oftentimes they're under scrutiny over their shape chits, whether or not they're authorized in the training environment. And then also just having the opportunity to get their hair cut by a barber. Granted, these are abnormal situations because we're currently in a pandemic, but the grooming services that are available on the Coast Guard base may or may not suit a diverse crowd. And I think all of the students should have the opportunity to provide that professional look if possible. So that's something that we can get better at as a service. The grooming standards are still evolving, and I'm glad that this conversation has been had and hopefully continues to be had. But I think engagement is the most important thing, engagement from leadership, whether it's mid-level or high-level leadership, about the type of environment you're fostering. If you notice that only the girls' buns that you're paying specific attention to are minority buns, perhaps you need to step back and see if that's something that needs to be addressed. Why is there a hyperfixation on only one subset? If any of my other panel members want to chime in on grooming standards, please don't let me hog the microphone.
So the only thing that I will add, I'll add two things real quick. As you talked about and referenced, the ability to have barbers on base be able to cut your hair in what you would deem as an appropriate fashion. So that is something that I dealt with at the academy. And it's very interesting. As I heard you talk, I remember being at the academy, and I remember going to the barber shop and being told by the available barbers that were there that they didn't know how to cut my hair. What that forced me and the other African-American males to do at the academy was we had to find our own way to cut our hair. So we knew the individuals that could cut hair. So you had Sean Bennett, who was in the class of 97, that knew how to cut hair. He was the African-American barber at the academy. Captain Art Ray, class of 98, he knew how to cut hair. So he became a barber. And then I think about Christian Soto, class of 2003, who knew how to cut hair. So he became the barber for the African-American students. So imagine being a cadet and you have time management issues you have to deal with, getting your grades, making sure your room is clean. And oh yeah, by the way, we got to get you to cut our hair so that we can look good on the weekend, because we can't just go to the barber. I would also like to mention that we have policies, we have standards that can help on the fringes. But if the problem is your individual perception, that is a hard thing to root out by policy. So if you're a person that just simply looks at a person and says, that is unprofessional in its look, even though it might be in standards, it might be aligned with the policy, you're still going to have that negative thought because the appearance is the problem for you. And that can easily transfer over to how you feel somebody would be in a performance-wise, or if they were in a special assignment where their image would be the ideal Coast Guard image. So just something to think about. And I'll turn it over to you, Commander Smith.
Thank you, Marcus. You know, I don't want to beat a dead horse. I think the reason we spend so much time on grooming standards is because, you know, as we think about how these systems have impacted our policies inside the Coast Guard, grooming is so basic. As YN1 said, we have policy about the way I can wear the hair that naturally grows from my scalp this way. And so it's really impactful that in its natural state that could be deemed as unprofessional. I'll be a little bit quicker with the other two examples. You know, one example of the ways our some of our systems could be impacted is in our assignment practices. I think that it was interesting for me to learn that some of our most high profile and exciting opportunities specifically for officers to really set yourself apart, jobs like aid to the president, et cetera, oftentimes require as a prerequisite that you come from a certain operational community, more specifically aviation or cuttermen. Well, we know that people of color and women are disproportionately missing from those communities. We don't have the same number of people of color who are aviators or pilots, and so, I'm sorry, or cuttermen. So if that's the prerequisite for those jobs that can really set you apart and put you on a track for senior leadership opportunities, et cetera, choosing from this group is going to, you know, offer more opportunity for some disparate results. In addition, you know, both Commander Canady and I, as Academy grads, have spent a lot of time supporting admissions efforts. And, you know, another example is just Commander Canady talked about Ruby Bridges in '65. Well, our first African-American graduate from the Coast Guard Academy was in 1966. And we know that students who are nieces and nephews and children of Coast Guard Academy alum or any service academy alum tend to be more propense to serve, tend to be more propense to be interested in the service, as well as do well in the application process. They're not unfamiliar with the process. They are have opportunity to be mentored and to learn in the interview stage to be prepared for that and do well. Well, if that is a leg up to getting into the academy and we have a finite number of years where we produce African-American alums, then we're going to struggle. That's going to impact our ability to get more people of color at the Coast Guard Academy. So these are just three really off the top examples of how years in our country of systemic racism, how that impacts the systems in our service, and then therefore how that impacts our results in the Coast Guard. Next slide.
So, as I mentioned earlier, with the examples of institutional racism, now we'll talk about the impact of that on representation, and really representation today. Because I hope that through going through that list and telling you the dates, you know, in line with what Commander Smith just said, I hope that people have the understanding that these institutional racist practices that are outlawed today still have an impact on where you see the economic resources, the wealth gap, and also the representation in senior leadership in the military and in civilian employment. If you think about the Coast Guard, the academy is still where a large majority of our senior officers come from. and the representation, if the representation there is low, then that's going to end up equating to a low representation 20, 30 years down the line on who our flag corps is. So if you look at the decision makers in this country, the decision makers in the Coast Guard, the decision makers in civilian employment, the directors, the vice presidents, the E-suite, the majority of those individuals that are making decisions, determining who's going to be their replacement, are white males. And a lot of that goes back to some of the institutional racism from the past. Now, clearly, there are people that have broken through. There are people that have been able to achieve a large amount of success. But when you look at a group of people, when you look at percentages and the numbers in relation to others, there's an impact there. I don't speak on it often, but when I became the CEO of Air Station Houston, I became only the 4th African American to command an air station in Coast Guard history. This is 2019. It's shocking. I went 17 years in this organization before somebody that looked like me was on my OER, that judged me on my performance. 17 years in the organization before I had one person that gave me my marks and rated me on my performance. That's a long time trusting that your ethnicity does not play into your performance evaluation. So I'll leave that there. Commander Smith, did you have something to add to this slide?
No, before we move to questions, I'll just add to those great points, Marcus, that in addition, I think it's very basic. The impacts that these things have had on our policies and how they show up is, a lack of diversity representation in senior leadership, for example. To be in the room to make decisions about uniforms, about grooming standards. If there are no people of color or women in that room, there's nobody to share that perspective. I recall that we only recently removed the requirement for recruiters to have a shade sheet. It took an African American interested in recruiting to make that, to bring that to the attention, because decision makers weren't thinking about it, because they didn't need a shave shit. And to somebody who understood that the reason African American men request a shave shit is because the way their hair grows from their face and the their inability to not get ingrown hair. So I think that it's important for people to recognize that there's a step process to this, in that as you look at how these systems impact the country, they are also impacting our great service and impacting the policies that we all work underneath, the practices and how we move. And as a result, creating this lack of representation in those rooms with people who can make differences, a singular perspective on our decision-making bodies, and a disproportionate impact on our recruiting and our retention trends. We know that people of color don't retain at the same rate as majority members in the service. And so all of these are just the end result of a lot of the issues that we've addressed. I think our ability to be aware of those allow us in our own right to help make better decisions, to make a change, and to positively impact these. And I think, moderator, we're ready to turn it back over to you so we can start with questions. Oh, I apologize. I think we have one more slide for Commander Canady.
So yes, this is a excerpt out of the Commandant's Guidance to Promotion Year 20 Officer Selection Boards and Panels. And The recent one for promotion year 21 has some language in it as well about diversity and inclusion. This is an example of a positive change that I have seen in the organization moving forward, moving the organization into a better direction when it comes to diversity and inclusion. We talk a lot about how important diversity and inclusion is, how important it is to champion these efforts, to make sure everybody feels welcomed, respected, and most importantly, everybody feels like they have the ability to succeed in this organization just like anybody else. We want every leader to understand that and value that. If that's what we want every leader to do, then we have to have that in mind when we choose who our leaders are going to be. So diversity and inclusion is now starting to be part of the conversation on promotion boards about who's going to be selected for that next rank. And I think that is an important step forward for our organization. And what I hope is that this motivates people that might have been on the sidelines to get into the game. What I hope doesn't happen is I hope that a number of people don't look at this as something to do just to get a check in the box and then continue to act the same way. So I won't read it there, but like I said, this and the promotion year for 21 has that in there. And I'm not sure if a number of people are aware of the language that involves with diversity and inclusion with the commandant's guidance to boards and panels. So that's what I wanted to add about that on that slide.
All right, thank you so much to our panelists. We'll go ahead and start the Q&A section of the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. I'll go ahead and ask the first question here. Where have you inserted yourself in a situation where a racist practice or policy was being implemented? How did that impact you, the member, and the perpetrator?
So good afternoon, good morning. This is Commander Smith again. And I will admit I had this question ahead of time, and I did not struggle to find an answer. I struggled to select a singular answer. Over 19 years in, 23 if you count my time at the Academy, I've had several opportunities to recognize racist practices or policies, and I think it's a good thing on our service that I've had a lot of opportunity to be a part of a solution to those, even as a junior member. But one that I'll use goes back to the time we spent talking about grooming standards. As an instructor at the Coast Guard Academy, I overheard some of my sponsor cadets talking about gel fives. And they seemed to be really upset. I wasn't aware of what this was. And in talking to them more, they explained a practice where the cadre would line up certain members of their companies and take them out on the bulkhead and give them gel to put in their hair. And they did this to those members whose hair seemed to be all over the place or unkempt or had a lot of flyaways, etc. Probably no surprise that disproportionately most of those members were African-American or other women of color. And this was a generic alcohol-based gel, and I am sure that all of the African-American women are nodding with me that that is not something that we use, a product that we would use on our hair. Alcohol is very drying. I won't go into the details, but not a product that we would want to use. But what was interesting is the perpetrators of this were phenomenal individuals, young cadets. And when I had a chance to talk to them, this was a practice they had seen when they had come through. That if you had trouble with your hair, we pulled you out, we gave you this gel, instructed you to put it in your hair so you could create this helmet bun. And it was really interesting to talk to them about what it was that they were trying to correct. And it wasn't getting in line with the policy. It was to get to this look that they believed was more professional, not having flyaways, not having any single hair out of place, which is not what the standard requires. And with a little bit of education about how that is not their job to get them to a look that they prefer, but to ensure that they were meeting the standard, how the use of this specific product was actually hurting the women of color, and how this was also not a sanctioned practice that we have at the Coast Guard Academy or in the Coast Guard. And so I think more impactful, obviously the young ladies who were benefited from the conversation, i.e. the swabs who no longer had to put this in their hair, were super thankful and appreciative and grateful. But it was interesting to me that these young leaders who really believed that they were doing something positive to help these young ladies were very appreciative of the dialogue that was created and understanding how what they were doing was not okay. And so I would leave, it was really valuable and experience for everybody involved. But I think a lot of times these are difficult conversations that get really icky. And luckily, when we had this conversation, I was pleasant. And surprise is not the right word, because it's exactly what I expected from these young ladies and the young men who were putting these jail fives together. But people were very excited to learn and to be a better leader, be a more inclusive leader to all of their subordinates.
Thank you so much, ma'am. The next question is to all of the panelists. Which of last summer's events has impacted you the most deeply, and why? And I'll hand this over to Commander Canady.
Yes, for me, the one that impacted me the most is the one with Amy Cooper in Central Park. This is the situation where a white female she was in Central Park, did not have her dog on the leash. An African-American male, Christian Cooper, asked her to put her dog on the leash, which was the policy in the park. Couple of words were exchanged. She didn't appreciate him asking him that. And she decided to call the police and claim that a African-American male was assaulting her in the park. And she put an emphasis on the fact that it was an African-American male. Now, the reason why this impacted me deeply, even though nobody ended up dying that day, I was reminded about how many African-Americans have died because they were falsely accused. And there was nobody there that would choose to believe them over somebody else. It made me think about Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was killed because a white woman said he had looked at her or winked at her, whistled at her. And come to find out, she lied. And she's still living today. And she just recently, in the past couple of years, admitted that she lied, made the story up, but he's dead. And it made me think about how many people that are in jail today or have records because they were falsely accused, and then they had to weigh their options of putting their life in the hands of a jury of their peers, and the only thing that they had was their story, whether it was true or not, all they had was their story and hope that the jury of their peers believed them. So that video, luckily Christian Cooper videotaped it. And what you got a chance to see is you had a chance to see somebody that full well knew the privilege that she had, that she could make that accusation and use his skin as a weapon against him by calling the police and simply saying a black man is harming me. If it wasn't for him videotaping and recording, now mind you, this is a Harvard graduate that was out bird watching. It didn't matter that he was an Ivy League graduate at the time. Only thing that mattered was what he looked like. So that just impacted me deeply because it made me think about where we are and how people know what's going on and they know the privilege that they have. And in that moment, she decided to use it for her gain. It also had me thinking about how many people, even in our organization and other organizations, that have disagreements and are concerned about being accused of being too threatening by your appearance. I have been pulled into a supervisor's office and been told that I need to be mindful of my body mannerisms because I come off as threatening. And this was in response to a situation where I was being disrespected. So that's the event that impacted me deeply because I think it just had some other ramifications that are deeply rooted in some of the issues that we're dealing with today.
So the events that impacted me most deeply this summer, unfortunately, there's too many to choose from. There's just far too many to choose from that have become hashtags and etc. Just this past summer, but over the years. But the one that, or some of the ones that have resonated with me most deeply, between Sandra Bland or Tony McDade or Breonna Taylor, is when not just race, but race and gender both intersect. You know, Black women and also non-conforming individuals, gender non-conforming individuals, are often the victims of violence, and it's normalized. It's normalized that this violence happened. And they're not always seen as tragic victims, but more likely they're villainized. You know, the Breonna Taylor case, you know, deeply resonated with me because she's Black, she's young, she was at her boyfriend's house, she was asleep. And, you know, I'm Black, fairly young, I'm a woman, I sleep sometimes. So it's upsetting to me that no way what she was doing at the time could merit her death. And, you know, in news cycles, if it was mentioned, there was also a question that went with it. In some way, did she deserve it? Was she really a victim? What was her part in it? And that was bewildering, you know, because this is a person who's a civil servant like myself. And so I could see myself in that. And then also the non-reporting on it, because it was months before there was any outrage. There were months before there was any protests. And even when there were any type of search for social justice on the manor, it still wasn't on the scale as, you know, perhaps those cases that were caught on video, or those cases where it was a male victim. And so the intersectionality of it, of not just being Black or a minority, but also your gender. And I mentioned the Tony McDade, you know, I haven't heard that outside of Florida. My family's from Florida, and that's a gender nonconforming individual who was killed by the police. And they're 6 times more likely to be killed by the police as well. So just being marginalized on multiple levels, it really resonated and was very solemn, you know, hearing those specific cases.
I'll just really quickly, this was actually an easy question for me. I am a very proud Georgian. I have driven through Macon, Georgia more times than I can count. I know people from the area. It's very close to being like a hometown kind of feel for me. And so the Ahmaud Arbery case, the African-American male who was killed while jogging by a father and son who chased him down and shot him because they believed that he was snooping in houses under construction in the area. And so that was difficult, that they weren't protecting their own property. They were protecting the property of someone who did not ask them to protect their property. But in addition, one of the individuals had been in the Coast Guard. And that struck me in a way I can't explain, to know that somebody who had worn a uniform, had been stationed in a city that I had been stationed in, could have come across with me and been a shipmate. And then particularly if you followed and stayed involved in that case, during his deposition and as he was in court, he cited his boarding team member training as why he knew that he needed to shoot Mr. Arbery when he was charging. That he felt like, I could tell because I am a trained law enforcement officer, trained by the U.S. Coast Guard, which I think people in our society would consider is a great thing. If I led with that, people would listen to me. That is a respectable thing to say. And he used the training that many of us on this call have to say why he knew he needed to shoot a Black man running through the streets. And so that was really, really difficult for me. And I think it really resonated in me differently as a member of the Coast Guard about how the ills of our society are absolutely have the potential to show up in our service, and that we have to keep our guard up with regards to our core values, with the way we communicate and work together and treat each other, because the potential that all the concerns in the world are not, you know, this belief that in the world's greatest Coast Guard, that we don't have the potential to have some of those same issues inside our service is something we need to all think about and not let our guard down to.
Thank you all for your such powerful answers. The next question that we have is for YN1 Commander Canady. How did you feel about the Coast Guard's response at your unit to recent events? I'll hand this over to YN1 to begin.
Okay, so I have an interesting feeling about that. So I think in some ways, I think it was very good, very progressive. At the time when most of the social unrest was taking place, I was at Training Center Petaluma and, you know, on the LDAC, and right away there was a response that, you know, we want to do something to let people know that this is on our minds, that we are not immune to the outside world, that we are aware that there's a call for justice, and so people can feel heard. And, you know, shortly thereafter, there were facilitated discussions about unconscious bias and how that could, you know, play into your leadership and how to help people have these conversations. And they were in small group settings in civilian clothes and happened throughout the departments, and that was very positive. Now, somewhat criticism I have of the response is something that maybe people don't think about often, and that's, you know, how much words have power. And when words have power, you need to be careful with your wording. So frequently, and I understand in the media, when there are social justice protests, they're only referred to as riots, and riots have a negative connotation. And so when we're getting our CGPOS text messages that there will be protests in the area and to stay out of the area, the verbiage used was there were riots, there's a possibility of riots in the area. And that was disconcerting to me because, you know, I feel like I'm upset as well. I also feel a call for social justice. I understand the need to want to march and protest, and 98% of the protests that were held over the summer were peaceful. So when they're only referred to in a negative or riotous manner, then that made me question, you know, even the Coast Guard's perception of me. Am I a negative person if I feel strongly that this is an issue that needs rectification? So in many ways, great, excellent, began facilitating the conversation, but then in smaller ways, you know, we still need to be mindful of how things impact our service members.
Thank you, YN1. For me, at my unit, it was really a learning moment for me. I think I ended up writing an article about intrusive leadership as a result of how I was personally feeling, dealing with a number of these events that had happened in a short time frame. And the article was simply just about the need for intrusive leadership in this moment, and for it not to be shied away from because it dealt with social justice issues or racism. And basically the need for supervisors and peers to ask their counterparts, are they doing okay with what was going on outside of the Coast Guard lifelines? So at the time, I did not have the conversation at the unit for the most part. The reason why was because at that time, as far as active duty, I'm the only active African-American active duty member at my unit. There's one civilian at the time. So I really did not, I thought I was the only person that was going through this emotional turmoil because of the things that I was seeing happening throughout the country. After I wrote the article, I had a couple of members come up to me and tell me that they were upset as well, that they were bothered by the things that they were seeing and how fellow American citizens were being treated. And to be honest, it took me by surprise, but it really shouldn't have. But I falsely assumed that they didn't feel that way. So I was very happy, very pleased when we started to have those conversations. Now, I will say throughout the Coast Guard, personally, I've seen a definite shift that the willingness and desire to have these conversations, these necessary conversations that sometimes are uncomfortable and sometimes difficult, have been happening throughout the organization. I've been a part of events like this a number of times, and I've heard about other events. So I think that is a positive way forward. That is one of the ways that we are going to come together as an organization, as shipmates, is by having these conversations. And I think that the desire to have them has definitely increased since these events have happened during the summer.
All right, thank you both for your answers. The next question is, what and how does allyship look like to you? And I'll hand this over to YN1 to begin with.
So to me, allyship, at least the goal of it, if I could design it, I wish that word could be synonymous with action or active. I think a lot of times people are just hoping for empathy, that you understand how I feel. But really, I think it should be action. It should be a person who is actively looking to learn, to broaden their perspective, to understand, whether that be engaging with people with diverse backgrounds or even diversifying your listening taste. You'd be surprised how eye-opening a podcast could be to help you understand perspective. And then also an action to lend your influence, because oftentimes the burden falls on, marginalized parties to defend themselves, but oftentimes others see the same thing, but they're afraid to say something because, oh, well, this doesn't necessarily concern me. But some of the best allies I've known have been people who've just taken a moment to be like, that doesn't quite look right. I'm going to insert myself here. I want to understand, and then lend their influence to help resolve situations. And then also just being a person who actively questions your perspectives, especially if it's being brought to your attention. So keeping an open mind if someone does open a dialogue with you, because sometimes perhaps your intention wasn't because of unconscious bias. Perhaps you didn't have negative intentions, but you have to be open and active in trying to better yourself at all times. So really, I think those are the things that would characterize allyship to me.
Yes, what YN1 hit that question out of the park. There's really not much to add to that. I think the allyship, the education piece or portion to allyship is important. I think that you have to be willing to educate yourself on these issues so that through that education, it could provide you with a newfound perspective on how you look at things. So some of the things that we mentioned today, once again, we don't have time to go into them all, but everybody has a smartphone and you can Google a lot of the things that we've talked about and go through your own personal journey in educating yourself on some of these issues. I know that I've had to do that with other ethnicities, getting involved with other affinity groups, and just taking the time to listen, to hear the stories. I was very moved and touched when I was able to listen in on the Spectrum panel that the PAC area LDAC did a couple of weeks ago. I learned a lot listening to our service members talk about their experience. Those are things that allies do. They take that opportunity to learn, to grow. I think that also, and I'll shift a little bit into some final comments or basically a charge or a challenge to everybody moving forward, is number one, never underestimate the impact that you can have by simply reaching out and mentoring somebody. And you have to do that with an intent to get outside of your comfort zone and mentor somebody that does not look like you. I had to do that myself. I had to tell myself that if I wanted to be the leader that anybody would come up to ask for advice, to ask for recommendations, to get some professional development, some mentorship, then I need to open myself up to everybody. So it was real easy and natural for me to connect with minority African-American junior officers and enlisted members because there was a cultural bond that we had. I had to actively get involved and actively pursue to develop those same sort of mentoring relationships with majority members. So a challenge that I have for everybody is that look at who you're mentoring and make sure that group of people that you're mentoring includes some people that do not look like you. One of the things that YN1 mentioned that I'll highlight as well is saying something. If you see something wrong, say something. Even if it doesn't directly impact you. If you know that it's wrong, if you know that it's putting your other shipmates at a disadvantage, they might not be in a position to make the change because they might not be in that department head meeting. They might not be the XO. They might not be the command master chief. But you might be in that room. So it is part of your responsibility to be vocal and speak up to make sure that, once again, everybody in our organization feels valued and everybody in this organization feels part of the team so that we can continue to do our missions and be effective at doing so. So I'll end there and we can open it up to any other additional questions.
All right, thank you so much to all the questions so far. I have one from Maureen K. How do you differentiate between systemic racism and institutional racism? Are they the same in your understanding? That's for all the panelists.
I think this goes back to a lot of what I said in the beginning. This is something I want to research more. And my understanding is that there's a lot of similarities between the two. Institution or systems, I think they both speak to how in our country and in our society, racism has been ingrained into our policies and practices and procedures and the systems that govern how we act. And so my understanding is that there's limited difference between the two, but I think that's a great question for me and everyone interested to research further.
I agree with Commander Smith in terms of further researching the matter, but in my understanding, systemic racism are the systems that are still impacting us today, you know, statistically, like the maternal mortality rates. I'm 243% more likely to die in childbirth than a majority female, which is due to systems in place in terms of how my opinion on pain may or may not be received, on how policies drive that. So I do believe they're intertwined, and I would need more research to know the specifics of which.
All right, thank you so much. Next question is, Commander Smith just spoke about barriers for advancement. What do you see as the glass ceilings in the service still haven't been broken through?
So I'll take that one. There are still some barriers to be broken. We haven't had a female commandant yet. We haven't had an African-American female selected as selected to the Flag Corps yet. We haven't had an African-American female assigned as a officer of an air station. So there are still some first that the Coast Guard still has yet to achieve. But I am hopeful that in the coming years that we will continue to have some first, but not overlooking the first, I think that it's also important that we get to the second, to the third, to the fourth, to eventually get to the point where it is not a surprise when these things, these glass ceilings or these achievements happen. That is really when we have moved culturally to a better place, when these achievements are commonplace and they're not even something that anybody feels the need to highlight. But I think we're moving in the right direction, and I do think that some of those firsts are going to happen pretty soon.
Would any of the other panelists like to answer that question? All right. Question to any of the panelists. Do you think there are any other areas similar to grooming standards where the Coast Guard currently needs to take a look at into whether we need an update or change to counteract the lingering effects of institutional racism on our service?
I think the very difficult process of taking a holistic look at all of our practices that govern how we operate, from assignments to, we talked about prerequisites for jobs. I think, I read somewhere that if you want to find all your opportunities for disenfranchisement, you take all your unwritten rules and write them down. And I think if we looked at all the things that we were doing, just like an unwritten rule that you got to do this to be that, or the unwritten rule that only these folks with this pedigree can do this, et cetera. And if we took a look at all of those and had them write them out down and allow that to be the start for the practice to identifying these issues so that we can remove them. So I think it's everywhere. I think it's in how we assign, it's how we advance, it's how we promote, it's how we do OERs and EERs, it's using 360s in more places. I think there's a lot of opportunities for us as an organization to identify other unintentional places where these policies and practices may be getting in the way of our ability to be inclusive, and most importantly, our ability to being the best Coast Guard that we can be, to ensuring that the best folks are making it through and getting to opportunities to be decision makers and make change in our organization.
I just wanted to add on to Commander's eloquent response. One thing, specifically with the unwritten rules. So a lot of times, or several anecdotes we mentioned today in which we got involved and intervened on behalf of someone else and stood up for them, are things that were happenstance. These are things where you just happen to be in the proximity and you were able to insert yourself and lend your influence. But I think if we could do a better job of getting at those unwritten rules, if those were clearly known. So I do believe a 360 marking system, at least at some point in the career, because how do we know how this leadership is actually filtering down if we're never getting the perspective filtering back up? Now, I do understand there's a Diomi survey, and that gives some insights, but in terms of relation to job performance, how do I know that there's an unwritten rule that this senior chief doesn't like shaved chits, which is something that I have heard at units before, that they don't want members who have shaved chits, which is a medical issue and should be a non-starter. But how do we know those unwritten rules unless we're getting that feedback? Other things that I can think of just offhand, we talk about professionalism. Sometimes professionalism is before you even get in the room, in terms of like a board or a panel or a special assignment. Before you get in the room, you know my name, and sure, that's pertinent, but is it? We have implods. I mean, if you want to get bias and unconscious bias out of it completely, there are connotations and attitudes versus non-conventional standard names. That is something that goes on within the service, and that shouldn't overshadow the ability for a person to do their job. So those are just some starting points that just based within this conversation that I thought of.
And I would like to add accountability. I think that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about and the efforts that we are taking to moving the organization in a better direction as far as diversity and inclusion, you have to hold people accountable if they don't do the things that you're expecting them to do. If they violate core value issues with respect, they have to be held accountable. You cannot talk about how important diversity and inclusion is and then give a pass or a safe harbor for somebody that is committing or displaying actions that we're trying to root out. We actually have to hold people accountable. People need to, have careers in. They need to lose recommendations for command. They need to have paper trail to hold people accountable. That's how you really start to force action, is through that accountability as well. That has to be part of this process.
All right, thank you all. Many BIPOC have experienced tokenism. Do you think the practice of continuing to ask members to notate their race or ethnicity for metrics is productive in the efforts to make the service more diverse and inclusive? Are we missing the mark by focusing on metrics?
I think that's a phenomenal question. And I think I have a couple thoughts. The first is you can't change what you don't measure. And if we don't know if we don't have a full understanding of who our people are, how they are moving as women, as people of color, as LGBTQIA+, as different, if we don't understand how as unique individuals we are moving through the organization, and we won't recognize problems. It'll be a lot easier to say these things that we always believe to be issues. We have to be able to prove them with data. And so I think there's value in being able to collect that information so we can really give ourselves a scorecard on how inclusive we really are. But I really quickly, when I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy in 2001, I found out shortly around graduation time that I was the Academy's first African-American female engineering graduate. 4 years at the Academy, busting my butt like most others, doing well at some things and poorly at others. I had no idea that was where I was. And so, I am actually thankful that as I was matriculating through the program, I didn't know that. Because the pressure that would have put on me to stay in the major, if I decided I wasn't interested and might wanted to switch majors, as an 18-year-old, that the pressure of that tokenism would have been very difficult. That is something that I am proud of, but I also feel like, to Marcus's point early, I hope there now have been hundreds of African-American female engineers and hundreds of fill in the blank of all types. And so I think it's important to recognize that we put a lot of pressure on those individuals who are the first, in addition to the unspeakable pressures that they have had to be in that situation alone as the only one like them. So I think there's a fine line. And I think the most important thing is to speak to the individual and see what their comfort level is in sharing their story of being the first, of being seen in that way, and allowing them to lead us to understand how they would like to be viewed and how much of that story they want to be included. So I think there's a twofold answer here. I think we have to keep those numbers so we can hold ourselves accountable as a service. But I think we need to be open to hearing what the individuals desire with regard to how they are a beacon for their unique situation.
Yeah, definitely an excellent question. I think as Commander Smith was once again eloquently answering that question, I was thinking back to the discussion about the precepts on the boards and panels. The thing that I would want to mention is that it's not about numbers. It's about actions. So the guidance to board and panels isn't about you have to accept these numbers. These are the numbers that we're looking for. These are the actions that we're looking for. So you can be, anybody can display those actions. And we should be looking for everybody to display the actions that we want. So you can be a white male and still communicate and display actions that show that you value diversity and inclusion. It's not simply, the only way that we measure whether we value it is not simply by if we're promoting African Americans or other minority groups, it's the actions. So I think that if we just think about it and we start going down the lines of quotas, then we're looking at it in a way that I think needs to change. It's about actions. And I think that if you change the actions, and through our actions, we become a more culturally aware and inclusive organization, then the numbers will play themselves out naturally.
On the subject of the metrics and tokenism and how that manifests, so tokenism in the Coast Guard is tricky because, you know, if you're a minority in the Coast Guard, depending upon your station, you may or may not be the only person of color there. And whether or not there's a metric or there's any point for me to write it down at any area, I definitely felt it. It's something that I know. So in a way, I don't think the metrics are harmful necessarily if it's just giving guidance to try to help become more culturally inclusive. And representation does help, and you do need the data in order to drive that. On the flip side of that, when I was on the instructing staff at the YNA school, I was the only Black female there. And I was happy to be able to insert myself and be an ear. I was the only Black person there. So, you know, many students would come talk to me, male, female, etc. And from all types of backgrounds, I was happy that I could be that person that they were comfortable talking to. And I think representation helps with that. But I don't necessarily think that that's the end of the conversation. Like Commander Canady was saying, that it's something that people have, that has to be taken upon yourself to try to be engaging to all parties, to all cultures. And that's something that has to be worked on. So I guess when it comes to that question, I don't really have the right answer. And I think at least the Coast Guard is trying to do better, to get the data so that we can see, are we hitting the mark or are we missing the mark? And I think that's just a dialogue that maybe needs to continue to happen.
All right, thank you all so much. We have time for one more question. Depending on the climate of the unit, there are conversation topics that are promoted and conversation topics that are considered still as taboo or not for the workplace. Racism, and specifically the words institutional racism being one of those topics. How can I, as a deck plate leader, as an E5, promote these conversations? How can I, when it comes up, teach my shipmates who just blatantly refuse to acknowledge the existence of institutional racism? Would you recommend providing training at units about diversity?
Well, I will start. I didn't get a chance really to get through. I think there are a couple people from Coast Guard CG127, the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, on the webinar. But I think one positive thing is that we are taking a really, exhaustive approach at looking at improving our D&I training, including creating champions who have been who've had these difficult conversations, who are experts, as we have all said that we are not, to be able to support units for those type of discussions, and support LDACs, to support affinity groups, to support units, and support the service. And so it is my hope that for the individual who asked that question, that the first start is that there will be an opportunity for you to get connected with one of these trained individuals moving through this curriculum that CG127 has been working through. I also think that I try to start small. You know, it may be a big topic to bite off institutional racism in the middle of in the middle of the command center or in the bosun's hole, but you can talk about how you can do things to be more inclusive. I think it's when people recognize how they can make improvements to get the job done better, to give examples of how as we improve our ability to be inclusive, we will be a better boarding team. We will be a better watch floor. We will be a better cockpit. So I encourage the individual to think about ways to bite this off into, small lessons to talk about, and things that are a little bit more disarming to start with, and move to a place where you can have more robust discussions and learn from one another. And then the final thing I'll say is to be willing to listen first. I think a lot of times when we discuss things that are really difficult, if we give a lot of information, it can feel like I'm preparing to be defensive. But to start it off open and to hear why this term is difficult for you, what makes you afraid of having this conversation or anxious about talking about this, and allow the individual to communicate first and be heard, then perhaps they will be more willing to listen. But I really applaud the member for asking that question, because I think that's probably the hardest part with what we deal with, is how do we bring our guards down and have these difficult conversations in the midst of the tumultuous environment that we are living in right now, and still be shipmates and still respect each other and both learn something and be better from it.
YN1, did you want to add something to that?
I mean, that was almost the perfect answer. So, but I think the big thing, if you're E5 and I'm an E6, there's not much difference in that. I think the most important thing, and I've had these conversations at almost every unit I've been at, is being open to have the conversation, whether it be in a formal setting or an informal setting. I've always been a proponent for LDAC. Sometimes they can help you set up that discussion, like a luncheon chat on a topic, and it doesn't have to be so daunting if it's guided, because sometimes people are just nervous to start a conversation that they don't necessarily feel fluent in, something that they're not the expert on. But these dialogues are important because gaining perspective is important. And if you don't want to do something as formal as with your LDAC or something sponsored by like a CMC or anything, some of the best conversations I had when I was at a small boat station was on the boat, when we take the 47 out and people let their guard down. And it's okay to just bring something up like, hey, so what do you think about this? But you also have to be open-minded, and all parties have to be open-minded so that you can give honest feedback and be open to receive honest feedback, so you can have that great shipmate relationship. Some of the closest shipmates I have definitely don't come from the same background as me, and that's something that we developed and cultivated through these dialogues and over time.
Yeah, that was excellent, YN1. I appreciate the words. The only thing that I would add is to consider what the goal is, especially at the workplace. When I have these conversations, my goal outside of the Coast Guard is different from inside the Coast Guard. If I'm talking to somebody outside the Coast Guard on the street, that conversation is more about changing somebody's hearts, minds. That's the goal. So if somebody doesn't believe in institutional racism in that sense, at the end of the conversation, then I failed. I think that when we're talking to members, Coast Guard members, we are trying to do that. That's an element. But for me, the overriding goal is how we're treating each other. So if you don't believe in institutional racism, I might not be able to win you on that. But I should be able to get you to treat a member inside the organization with respect. I should be able to get you to treat every member as somebody that should be valued, to invest in every member, to want to mentor, to want to lead. How you fill out that performance evaluation. Those are the things when we talk about members that I think for me is the goal. Is, you know, whether I get you to understand and agree with the impacts of institutional racism on today is not the success or fail. It is how you're treating the members. If I can't get you to treat every member the same and help every member realize their full potential, then that is the failure. And it can be very minor. It could be simply, hey, a minority JO comes up to you for advice and you say, hey, got it. Here's a little bit of advice. Good luck. Another majority member JO comes up to you and reminds you of yourself when you were younger, and you give that same advice, but then you say, hey, I know somebody that's over there at the assignment that you're trying to get. Let me make a phone call for you. Or I know the detailer. Let me make a phone call for you. Or I know somebody that's going to be picking that special, whoever's doing that special assignment. Let me make a phone call for you. Like, those are the things that we have to get a hold of if we're not giving those sort of opportunities to everybody that is deserving of it. For me, when I'm talking to members in the organization, the goal is to change how you're treating each other.
Thank you so much for all of our panelists. Thank you for not only providing invaluable information about how institutional racism impacts our policies and our service, but also leaving us with action items and thoughts to take beyond this presentation. In normal times, we would present you with a token of appreciation in person, but given the current circumstances, we'll have to mail you to you instead.
Thank you again to everyone for spending your valuable time with us this afternoon. And we hope to see you at our next event. Mark your calendars for Thursday, April 15th, which will be Raising Children in an Unequal America, featuring New York Times bestseller, Dr. Jennifer Harvey. This discussion will discuss the challenges that exist when it comes to raising children in a society that is both racially diverse, but also full of racial inequality and injustice. This concludes today's presentation. Thank you for your participation, and we hope to see you for the next one. Thank you again.